So last week, for those of you who are here, we started talking about translation, so words and concepts and categories that have no one-to-one correspondence with English. So this week we want to kind of continue that theme, but with some concepts from further afield. And we're also really elated to welcome Bruce Parry to the session today. For those of you who don't know him, Bruce, among many things, is a filmmaker. He came from a military background that, if I'm not wrong, was interrupted by love and mushrooms, I think, and through a series of unexpected events as these things go, ended up as the host of 2 shows on the BBC, Tribe and Arctic. But I discovered Bruce through a documentary that he made called Tawai, A Voice from the Forest. And I watched it and my reaction was basically, this is the most ambitious, carefully crafted documentary I've ever seen. The blend of themes is so impressive. It kind of seamlessly moves between the political struggles of this egalitarian nomadic tribe in Borneo to McGilchrist's divided brain theory that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, to spiritual practices and festivals in India, to linguistics in the Amazon, and it's all brilliant. But there were 2 aspects that really kind of stuck with me. And the first is this scene in where Bruce is staying with this group, the Panan. They're a hunter-gatherer society, and he describes a conversation where the Panan are telling him that they know when a particular tree is fruiting because a particular bird flies over. And Bruce asks whether they know when the bird will fly over, and they're like, what? When the bird flies, we go. And then he describes asking them, yeah, but can you anticipate when the bird will fly? And they're like, why would we want to anticipate it? It's a ridiculous question. When the bird flies, we go. And then the second aspect that really stayed with me was the commentary on the Piraha, who are a group that live in the Brazilian Amazon. And the documentary explains how they don't have words for either colors or numbers. And it's quite a small section in the film. So I emailed Bruce, like, this is astonishing. Do you have more footage of this? And he very, very kindly said, yeah, let's meet and chat. But I can't emphasize enough how much this material kind of opened my own research up to areas that I'd never even imagined. And yeah, Bruce has been incredibly generous with his time and knowledge since then. And yeah, super, super happy to have you, Bruce. So one theme that comes up again and again in the study of Indigenous languages is the amount of local environmental knowledge that can be encapsulated in linguistic systems. So naming things based on relationship rather than attributes. There's a really good book called Dying Words by this guy, Nicholas Evans. I might have mentioned it before. And he gives some examples from Arnhem Land, from Aboriginal languages, examples where the rhythms of the local landscape reverberate through the semantic patterns of its inhabitants. And one example that he mentions is a species of fish called the spangled grunterfish, which is just a great name anyway, and how it shares its name with a white apple tree that lives in the same area. It's a Sigium eucalyptoides in Latin, because basically the fish eat the fruit that fall from the tree and that fall into the billabong. In Kumwinku, obviously saying that wrong, both are called, share the same root term of bocorn. And another example that he mentions is one where the call of a particular grasshopper signals the ripeness of a particular type of yam. And in this context, the grasshopper and its call and the yam, again, share the same root word. And obviously, sort of Western scientific taxonomy doesn't permit these kinds of relational semantics between plants and animals. You know, plants and animals have different genetic lines of descent and different attributes, so they have different scientific names. And you know, the aim of scientific language is to reduce ambiguity, and obviously that's really useful. But then there's so much knowledge of the natural world and systems and relationality contained within so many Indigenous language systems. You know, it's such a clear demonstration of why language protection is so essential. Some categories and words, they're so contextually distinct that they can only really be understood through long periods of cultural immersion. Anthropologist Jerome Lewis, whom I also discovered thanks to Bruce, he gives a really interesting example of this through his elaboration of this word aquila, a word from the Benjeli, a hunter-gatherer community in the northern Congo. So he introduces Aquila in this journal article as a confusing body of seemingly unconnected and diverse practices. So the word can indicate, he says, menstruation, blood, taboo, a hunter's meat, animals' power to harm humans, reproductive problems, production in general, health, and sanity. But he really emphasizes that understanding this word was a slow revelation, one that took years of living among the Benjeli community. And one of the obstacles from a kind of Western fieldwork point of view was that even though Aquila was mentioned daily, people wouldn't talk about it as a standalone thing. In his words, people rarely talk about Aquila directly, especially not as an abstraction or specific body of practices. Aquila prescriptions are normally discussed spontaneously in real life situations only when they're not being followed, or in an effort to explain misfortune. In its broadest unfolding, Aquila is a body of practices that regulate the Benjeli's social and environmental relations. One time, he says, we came across a whole area of forest that was Aquila. Leaf cones placed on every path leading into it warned people not to get food there or hunt, but simply to pass through. Aquila is an idiom that the Benjeli use to manage the relationships that compose their total environment, which includes animals and people and spirits in the forest. Aquila condenses values and meanings to establish a cultural store that ensures internal communication between generations without attributing special status or authority to individuals or institutions. So it's like a group of practices that maintain cultural cohesion and values, like a set of social codes that don't need to be formally enforced because they're kind of woven into the mythology and the language. I imagine that some of you have come across Tyson Yunkaporta as well in his book Sand Talk, which I really can't recommend enough. He's an Australian academic, but he had an Aboriginal upbringing. So he's embroiled within two very different patterns of being and knowing. And he very wittily reflects on the dissonance between these systems. Even things that seem really basic to us, like first person pronouns, they don't align between the two languages. In English, the first person pronouns are I, me, and we, us. In Aboriginal languages, there are a lot more, pronouns that would translate as like we too, or we but not others, or we all together. And Yunkaporta is a real kind of trickster character. He's a rigorous scholar, but he also diligently breaks the conventions of academia. And he talks a lot as well about how time is encoded differently across languages. He tells this anecdote about being at work at the university where he teaches and getting phone calls from a grandmother, and how it could be really frustrating in that context to code switch from a language where there are no separate words for time and space. He says, in grandma's traditional language, she asks you something that translates directly into English as what place, but actually means what time. And you reluctantly shift yourself into that paradigm because it'll be hard as hell to shift back out of it again when you go back to work. And it even points out that there's no word for work in his home language or in any other Aboriginal language that he's encountered. I can only imagine how jarring it must be to switch from time as space and space as time to like giving a lecture at 3:05. And he talks about how futile it is to even try and explain Aboriginal notions of time in English, because all we can say is that it's understood as non-linear, which kind of undermines the effort, because the main thing that you register in that utterance is the term linear. It's only describing a concept by saying what it's not rather than what it is. He explains that we don't have a word for non-linear in Aboriginal languages because nobody would consider traveling, thinking, or talking in a straight line. And this is something that really, really interests me, because for about 10 years, between the ages of like 14 to 24, probably, I was a slave to clock time. Like, I mean, pathologically organized. Like, I'd plan every aspect of my day, like even leisure time, like from 7 to 8, I'll read this book. And then from 8:15 to 9:30, I'll watch this documentary. And at 9:40, I'll call my friend, but only for 20 minutes because it was hell. And I wasn't like going out of my way to do this. I wasn't trying to do this. It was like these timetables would just impress themselves upon me, and I couldn't get out of them. And it just got worse and worse as I got into my 20s. Like I'd know every single thing that I was gonna eat that day, like down to the last piece of chocolate and exactly what time. And it drained the life out of everything because I was never like really there in the thing that I was doing. I was just constantly conscious of this metastructure. And it was really difficult to express why this was such a problem, because in the West, there's this kind of glorification of being really organized and managing time. I even remember studying that Joseph Conrad novel, that The Secret Agent, during my master's, and it's about this guy who's been ordered to bomb the Greenwich Observatory, and it was taught to us as an example of a random, completely apolitical act of terrorism, as though the measurement of time were this completely neutral thing. And I didn't question it at all. Because also this fixation had kind of characterized my whole adult life. And it was only when I started taking mushrooms and LSD that I like got to experience existence without this kind of oppressive awareness of the clock. And everything changed. Like for the first time in my adult life, I could be present for extended durations. I could be creative and spontaneous. And then, like, the best of all, like, synchronicities started happening, because synchronicities don't happen if you're a sort of slave to routine. So then watching Bruce's documentary and hearing about the Piraha, the community who don't even have numbers, was mind-blowing. So the Piraha, they're a hunter-gatherer tribe based in the Amazon basin in Brazil. And they've become quite well known in recent years through the work of this American linguist called Dan Everett. And he initially went to visit them as a Christian missionary. His job was to go there, learn the language, and translate the Bible. Like he was in love with God at the time, and had good intentions, wanted to share that with others. But as he slowly got to know the language, he discovered that their grammatical system is stubbornly anchored to non-abstract subjects which fall within the immediate experience of the interlocutors. So they don't have creation mythologies. He says that in 30 years, he never heard anybody talk about anything more than 2 generations past. So that's a really big linguistic ideological gap if you're trying to explain the relevance of Jesus Christ and things that happened over 2,000 years ago. So he discovered that the Piraha basically express only what they see, and they'll only believe what someone else tells them under the condition that the speaker personally witnessed what they're reporting. So since Everett had never actually met Jesus, his relevance was entirely unsubstantiated in their sort of philosophical linguistic system. And in the end, they converted him to atheism. He realized that these people weren't lost, and that what he was actually doing was sort of deeply colonialist. So he spent his career studying their language and wrote a really interesting book about both his own experience and the Piraha language itself and their culture. It's called Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes. Actually, that's another example of a culture with a different narrative around sleep, going back to the other week. So anyways, the claims that Everett was making about the Piraha language, they ended up being really controversial, basically because they refuted some of Noam Chomsky's theories about like universal grammar, and Chomsky was the kind of godfather of linguistics at this time, and Everett was a guy coming out of the jungle making these bold claims about a language that no one else speaks. Long story short, Everett was basically claiming that the Piraha has no recursion, which Chomsky had claimed to be one of the universal features of language. Recursion is where you can like keep adding things to sentences. So Reanne said, that Ros said, that Petra said, that Vlad said, or saying and this and this and this. But apparently Piraha doesn't do this. Apparently there's no word for and no word for or. And since Dan Everett did this work, lots of linguists have been to visit the Piraha, and they've all come to the same conclusion: no recursion, no color terms, no numeracy. And it took me a little while to get the relationship between these last two, but both colors and numbers, that they're used to quantify beyond immediate sort of spatio-temporally bound experience. So if you have a concept of red, you can talk about red things as an abstract category. He uses the example of don't eat red things in the jungle. But the Piraha don't talk about colors except for describing specific objects in their own experience. So they use phrases like that is like blood, or that is like the sky, or that's not ripe yet. There's no generic catch-all red or blue or green. And he talks about how this community actually asked him for some basic numeracy and literacy classes. They were trading with local Brazilians and wanted to kind of better understand those exchanges. But he says that after 8 months of daily efforts without ever needing to call them to come to class, all meetings were started by them, the people concluded that they could not learn this material and classes were abandoned. Not one learned to count to 10, not one learned to add to 3, or even 1 if regularly responding to is evidence of learning. Only occasionally would some get the answer right. He says, we were never able to train Piraha even to draw a straight line without serious coaching, and they were never able to repeat the feat in subsequent trials without more coaching. The concept of a correct way to draw was profoundly foreign. It reminds me of the study that I mentioned all the way back in the first semantrics session about the individuals who were cured of their congenital blindness as adults, and the tedious learning that it took for them to be able to distinguish a triangle from a square. And Everett says that they don't generally use pronouns either, which also makes sense, as it's kind of using something ambiguous or vague in place of a proper name. And also that they distinguish plants at the species level and don't use that generic mid-level category that we talked about in session 4. But he's not saying that the Piraha lack the capacity for abstract thought, but he suggests that it is extraordinarily difficult to acquire these patterns of cognition later in life. The young children in the community, they were able to learn these things, and it's really extraordinary research. And the only thing that I feel ever so slightly uneasy with is the way that some of it's framed. Not so much in the book, but in Everett's academic articles, that the one that we sent out, that the focus is on the constraints of this linguistic system, but their language, it's unquestionably in sync with their culture and their environment, apart from the recent trading with Brazilians. And I'd suspect that this kind of lack of grammatical temporality is probably an advantage if your livelihood depends on hunting and foraging, which demands kind of absolute attention to your immediate surroundings and not kind of abstract mind wandering. It could be that the difficulty that the adult Piraha experienced in their numeracy classes is something akin to the difficulty that most Westerners experience when trying to remain absolutely in the here and now, in sort of modernized civilizations based on consumerism and a sort of measured 24-hour day, counting and timekeeping, so future orientation. These are primary skills, but in an Amazonian community that operates on hunting and foraging and sharing, like, you just don't need numbers. So I think language systems like this, that they can really help us to reflect on cultural structures and grammatical patterns that steer our attention to somewhere else, to some other time that's not here and now, which really aligns nicely with McGilchrist's work, which is what Bruce's documentary so elegantly explores. We talked a few weeks ago about the research that says how language begins in the right hemisphere in children, and then the balance shifts when we learn to read and write and sort of go through the Western education system, and also about how the balance between the activity in the hemispheres seems to vary from language to language. I use the examples of the evidence that reading Chinese engaged more of the right hemisphere than English, possibly because of the sort of pictorial and tonal complexity as well. And Piraha sort of takes this one step further. Its use of tone and accent, it's so extensive that it can be whistled or hummed. It's much closer to music and the right hemisphere than English would ever permit. And also, like many indigenous languages, it has no written counterpart. The written versions of most indigenous languages, they're either created by linguists or missionaries. So for most languages, there's some basic grammar guide, a dictionary, and a translation of the Bible for most languages. We're actually going to do a session, not sure yet, that looks at some of David Abram's work on the effect that literacy might be having on our sensory experience of the world. And Tyson Yunkaporta has a similar hypothesis, although kind of worded slightly differently. He suspects that literacy causes brain damage, that basically a focus on the sort of linear, abstract, declarative knowledge not only fails to create complex connectivity, but, actively damages the mind. This is kind of one of the reasons why we wanted to try doing the bulk of these sessions orally as well, to sort of explore that area. But this also, it reminds me of a conversation I had with my friend Ivan a few weeks ago. So he's this Mexican exceptional guitarist and bassist, and he learned by ear when he was about 10. So he learned all the scales by ear, and he was like famous in the town for being able to play them really fast. And he told me that a few years into playing, he started to study music theory, and it massively disrupted his fluidity, especially the speed of like playing music scales. And I don't know, it makes me wonder whether we'd be more competent in some aspects of language if we couldn't read and write. Like literacy certainly seems to compromise memory, and I imagine many aspects of creativity. I don't know, in English, I feel that sort of generally speaking, for most people, creativity in language, it's a feature of poetry and comedy. There's a linguist called Janice Knuckles also, who's done some really interesting research on Pastasa Quechua, and a feature of this language called sound symbolic performance, which is where language is used to imitate sounds and rhythms and visual patterns. So that the closest comparison, or not really a comparison, to English would be onomatopoeia, but it's much more extensive in this particular iteration of Quechua. So, for example, she talks about people telling stories about things that have happened to them, and how one of the markers of good storytelling is the creative use of this form. So, for example, you might use like repetitions that get quieter and quieter and quieter to simulate the experience of watching something appear to grow smaller as it moves further away, like a sort of auditory analog of the visual illusion of depth perception. So it works on an aesthetic, theatrical level, but it also communicates precise and explicit information. So just to start to kind of wrap this up before we ask Bruce a few questions. Prior to colonization in the USA, it's estimated that around 300 different languages were spoken. Now that's reckoned to be about 150. I'm talking about native languages. By 2050, that's expected to reduce to about 20. That's a massive, massive loss of linguistic diversity, a massive loss of knowledge about relationships in the natural world. And, just like any other ecosystem, more diversity equates to more stability. To quote the cultural anthropologist Russell Bernard, any reduction of language diversity diminishes the adaptational strength of our species because it lowers the pool of knowledge from which we can draw. I think it also reduces our idea of what language can be. As David Abram points out, in indigenous oral cultures, language seems to encourage and augment the participatory life of the senses, while in Western civilization, language seems to deny or deaden that life, promoting a massive distrust of sensorial experience while valorizing an abstract realm of ideas hidden behind or beyond the sensory appearances. We went into this in session 2, the session on metaphor, the sort of the dominant metaphors for the mind and the knowledge and knowledge, and how much of mainstream Western education is just shaped by the capacity to abstract. And as you can imagine, Juncker Porter is extremely critical of Western education. There's a section in the book that talks about how sort of Western education, its origins can be traced back to horse domestication in Prussia. He says that to domesticate an animal, you must, 1, separate the young from their parents during the daylight hours, 2, confine them to an enclosed space with limited stimulation or access to natural habitat, and 3, use rewards and punishments to force them to comply with purposeless tasks. Definitely resonates with my school days. While Aboriginal knowledge, he says, lies in the processes rather than just the content. You know, there's a long tradition in Aboriginal society of ritual training in the use of metaphor, especially during initiation into other states of knowledge. He says, because metaphor is the way that law, women's and men's businesses, ritual, ceremony, and magic has worked. Powerful metaphors create the frameworks for powerful transformation processes, but only if they have integrity. And he explains how a metaphor that lacks integrity damages connectedness, an action that's known as a curse in his culture. We've talked a lot about the problematic Western trope of, you know, absolute truth, of school assessments being based on correct answers, or the metaphor of argument is war, that you win. And again, this contrasts with the concept of yarning, another Aboriginal concept where the aim is to kind of come together and share different ideas and perspectives, but the idea isn't sort of to win. The aim is to kind of build a loose consensus so that you have a view of reality from as many different perspectives as possible. You know, that the aim is not to end up with one point of view being dominant, as though, you know, this is more true or this is the truth. It's much the same when you bring Indigenous communities together who have different ways of using ayahuasca, that the point isn't to get them to agree on any one thing. The point is that they kind of tire themselves out arguing and they come away with a better understanding of the others. And so there's about 6,000 to 7,000 languages left in the world. And about 80 to 90% of those are Indigenous languages. There's only about 250 languages left that are spoken by 1 million people or more. So this is a really unprecedented time in terms of language loss. You know, languages have never been disappearing at a faster rate. But on the flip side, I think people are becoming more and more aware of what's at stake here, you know, of what's being lost, and more and more curious about the issue. So I'd take that opportunity to say thank you all for being here. Really, I'm gonna pass it over to Rosalind.
Amazing. Thank you, Reanne. So yes, I've got a lot of questions for you, Bruce, some of which relate to all the way back to tribes, some of which are kind of more directly inspired by Reanne's presentation that we've just had. And I think one that kind of goes along both those lines is, well, there's such an amazing rapport that you have with the people that you visit in tribes. And that's one of the really beautiful things to watch unfold on camera, is this friendship developing, and they're so happy, it seems, in so many of the different scenes to be showing you what they are of their cultures. And there's this moment in just before you're about to do the Mattis ritual, where you've got the plant juice that goes into your eyes, and you're kind of saying, I'm on my own now, I've not got my interpreter with me. And that made both Reanne and I really curious about what happens when you don't have your interpreter, and for how much of the time is the interpreter there, and what's the feeling of relying on an interpreter like, what's the distinction between kind of the rapport that you have with them versus the translated words, and how much does the quality of interpretation couch the quality of the interaction, and yeah, just generally what's it like the interpretation?
Yeah, how does that work?
Interaction?
Yeah, thanks, Ross. That's a great question. And Reanne, wow, just so loved listening to you speak there. You delivered such a gentle and calm way. It's such a great way to receive information. You do it so well. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
It's really enjoyable, really enjoyable. the translation and the interpretation and the transliteration and all those things all packaged into one one time that we have in the forest, because when we go and live with the group, we always take at least 2 interpreters with us, and one will be like by my side the whole time to just allow me to negotiate my way through and to have conversation, and then the other one will be outside with the crew who are looking at all the rushes from the day before and translating them in real time, because we won't get a chance to do that when we go back to the UK. So that all happens in real time out there. But for me, I have one person who's always with me. And that, of course, is a fundamental relationship. Sometimes I have 2 if there needs to have more than one language in order to get from where we are through a more local language and then into English. So it would be either 1 or 2 translators who's always with me. And there's so many different ways in which that is beautiful and also problematic. For me, when I'm doing something, when there's activity, I kind of generally don't need translation, because I try and connect through sign language and eye contact and tactility. And it's like pretty obvious if we're chopping a tree down or if we're collecting water or whatever, I can be there, and it's all hugs and that's where I definitely connect the most. I learned really early on that whenever I tried to remember local words, I just got caught up so much in my head, it slowed me down. And I kind of made a plan quite early on. It's just like, forget that, just be present, just be helpful, just be attentive. And that's the best way I connect. And that was by far the best connection I had with the people. But then, of course, if any time that you want to talk about something abstract out of the here and now, then you need someone there to ask, okay, what's happening tomorrow? What happened? What do you normally do at another time of year, or whatever it is? Those would be when the interpreter comes into his own or her own. Actually, it was always a guy, so his own. And that was cool too. But generally, those people had been, and obviously there was a different one everywhere I went. They'd generally been educated because they were from that language group, but living in a village that was closer to a larger town, often being whipped away by missionaries. And so they generally refused to sleep with me in the hut because it was much too uncomfortable. So I would go and be in the tree house or the teepee or the whatever, and they would stay with the crew because it was too difficult. And that was interesting as well, because what that meant was I could only communicate so far as there was light. So when the fire was on, it was all about sign language, but as soon as the fire went out, I was mute. That was it. There was nothing that I could do anymore, because it was all about literal connection mostly through the eyes and sign language and laughter and touch. So that was kind of my relationship with the interpreters. But you spoke quite a lot just now, Reanne, about the Piraha, and by far the biggest nightmare I've ever had anywhere with any of this was with those people. And if I'd known any of this, I just wouldn't have gone. I mean, it has ended up being one of the most interesting, like, mind-bending experiences of my life. And I'll try and explain a little bit about why that is in a second. But the amount of difficulty that I had with this particular trip was unbelievable. So Daniel Everett at the time, who I'd met beforehand, was not allowed to go back in because the whole Chomsky fight was so big that the Chomskyites had got into the universities in Brazil and made him persona non grata, so he wasn't allowed to go back. And they used excuses of him being once missionary to bolster that. So he wasn't allowed. His wife who still is a missionary and works in the area. And I kind of didn't want to use her, because the whole reason that I wanted to go to the Piraha was because I'd read in Daniel's book that these people have, through the fact that they are so present, because they have no future or past tense, they have this connection with some voice that they call some essence from the spirit realm that guides them. And I'm like, okay. And Daniel was pretty dismissive about this, but I'm like, okay, well, clearly you're going to be dismissive because you're a Christian now turned atheist. And so you've like, you know, we all go through that phase where you're so embarrassed about being that you now have to be the other. So it's like, but I'm in the middle here and I'm curious as to about what this is. So we found an interpreter, a guy called Varao, who was born of two. What his mum was from the outside, and his father was the chief of one of the villages. But he'd left at the age of 10, and he ended up becoming our interpreter. But what was so fascinating, and I don't want to make this story too long, but there's so many layers to it.
No,
but what
please,
was really fascinating was that when I then took the translations back to Daniel, Daniel threw them all out and said they were absolute nonsense. And I'm like, what? This is our guy. And and then at the same time as saying it was nonsense, refusing to do the translations himself, which left me in the middle going, well, I've spent tens of thousands to make this thing. And now the man who is supposedly the voice of the only person who's ever really translated and understood their language and grammar is telling me that he hasn't got time. And he was always sweet, but he just wouldn't do it. So I'm left in this really complex space. In the end, I go back and I find his wife, and his wife tells me something interesting. And she ends up becoming my translator of the stuff that Varao did to like confirm it, to like double check it. And what ends up being interesting is that his wife, Karen, says that basically the kids in their society don't really get the language until they're about 10 anyway. And this is the time that our guy leaves. Up until then, it's more song and dance and movement and all of this other stuff. And it's posture and it's a whole bunch of things. And then they kind of click into the linguistic aspect later on in life. A little bit like what you said about it's been shown that children are more right hemisphere at the beginning and then well, it seems that this is very, very heavily so with these people up until 10. And then when I looked at the translations, the difference between what Varao was saying and what the few bits that I did get from Daniel Everett is that Daniel Everett was an exact word for word translation of each of the words that were coming out, which would often be quite confusing poetic pieces. And Varao would come out, he would say a different thing every time, but always come to the same point. And it was like these two, one was very linear and you had to interpret it using sort of like transliteration, if you will, whereas the other one was just like Varao would just say it as it was, not giving a shit about the words that we used along the way. So he'd explain what the intention was, the meaning, exactly. And so these two things became my fight all the way through. And that was a head fuck because I was having Daniel saying that's not real. And at the same time, Varao, who was like the indigenous person and the person who was having a relationship with the community. And so, I mean, I could go on. There was so many more layers to that, but it was a really interesting look at all of this stuff that I was learning from Ian about them using poetry, song, whistling, dance, posture being their main form of communication. And then the one guy who's learned it is coming out with this much more linear perspective. And that's, I think, why it is that they had this extraordinary relationship with the spirit realm, because they're the only group that I've ever been with who don't need to use plant medicine or drumming or any other practice in order to have a voice that speaks to them on a daily basis.
There's no music. There's no music.
They do have music, but they don't use it for that. When they go into the forest, they just receive this guidance. And I'm like, I really want to know what this guidance is. Where I went there with the one question, basically, it's like, how do you hear this? Where does it come to you? And they said, we feel it in our heart, and then it becomes words in our heads. And that was them being guided by this spirit realm in this space, and it totally blew me away.
I'm going to say something that I don't know enough about, but is it McGilchrist who talks about a theory that possibly that was the Greeks, the sort of ancient,
yeah,
that it wasn't so left hemisphere based, so their kind of internal monologue was heard as an external voice, and it was only with this kind of left hemispheric imbalance that it became understood as our internal monologue, this sort of self-reflexivity.
Exactly. Yeah, the Greeks have a word for that voice, and they did talk about it originating in the stomach, in the body, in the heart. But, so no, it was the chest. I think they call it that, being in the chest area. So this isn't. This is something that probably we all once had. We've done a very good job of entering much more into that left hemisphere, and the Hall of Mirrors excluding it probably.
So then you had to balance these two translations. Then you had these sort of.
Daniel was basically didn't help, and so I used Karen. And I don't know if you remember in the film, there's one bit where we take the guys to the forest and they look at all the trees that they've just chopped down and burnt, and the people themselves are saying, the trees are telling us, please don't burn us, we're like humans too, it hurts, please don't do this, and like we're now at war with the forest and all this sort of stuff. And so I heard this when I was with Karen, the Daniel's old wife. And she was like, when she heard them saying this, she goes, oh, I can't believe they're saying this is not true. I don't, but this is so. I didn't feel that she was lying, because she was saying something that she was kind of like had never heard before, but she was translating it exactly. There was no reason why the people themselves would make that up, because it doesn't make them look good. And then I later found out that it was the anthropologists themselves who had introduced them to agriculture. And so the whole thing was this like, so this testimony that I was getting, I felt justified in putting it in, because like it was in no one's interest for those words to be promulgated. They were all sort of self-damning for everyone involved in the translation process. And so I was like, okay, I'm buying this. This is amazing.
That reminds me of a really awkward moment in Tawai where the Panan, they're talking about God, and this guy's I don't remember exactly, but he's sort of like, it's like, we're told to believe this, and then someone else says like, no, we don't talk about that, stop.
Yeah, that was the women telling him to shut up. Yeah, which he did. And also just as the heart collapses, I don't know if you got the poignancy of that moment as well. While he was denying omens, the heart collapsed. So
yeah, no, it's really tense. It's really, really tense.
It's quite, it's an interesting moment, isn't it?
So they've had missionaries trying to convert them, and
for sure, for sure.
Yeah.
But I love what you said about the Piraha, because like it's true, they're like, well, have you seen Jesus? Has your mum seen Jesus? Has your grand, have you been to where he's from? No, well, we got no interest at all. Yeah, they're a very, very curious bunch, those guys.
There's another moment in Tawai that I think it's in your cut footage, but it's just such an interesting cultural moment that's so wildly different from anything as we conceptualize it in English, that I'd love to ask you to tell us about it. It's the Benjali penis song ritual that the women do. And yeah, I'd love if you could just maybe introduce that to us.
Oh my God, yeah. There was a number of things that didn't make it into the film. There's a whole ayahuasca section that didn't make it in, and there was also this trip to Africa to go with Jerome and Ingrid Lewis, the anthropologists, to the group that Reanne was talking about, the Benjeli, who are these pygmy peoples of the Congo, quite possibly one of the oldest unbroken lineages of human beings on the planet. And I was with them when they took us through an initiation ceremony, which was what they say was the how the origins of human society itself emerged, and what this some anthropologists now think, and it very much feels like it when you go there, is as a reenactment of the moment that the women say no to the alpha male and invite the other men to come and live with them. And that's the beginning of human society, where men and women live together. And at that time, the women who were super powerful, the ones who were inviting the men in, kind of make an agreement. You can come live with us, provided that you leave behind your aggressive and competitive ways. And that's the beginning of the next 180,000 years, which many people now believe was generally egalitarian for all humans throughout the world, especially through the tropical belt. So that's a big thing that most people don't really know about. And there'll be people that will deny that, but I think that the evidence is growing and growing, and certainly from my personal experience, that feels like how it is. But what you get from that is these insights that Jerome and Ingrid offered, which you don't really see with the Penan, because the Penan seems so placid and gentle, but with the Benjeli, you get to see that they have a whole bunch of tools and narratives and methodologies for maintaining this egalitarian state. It's not a natural state and needs a lot of work at all times. And so some of them is just like, if anyone starts showing off or hoarding, that people get together and refuse to allow that guy to, you know, they retrieve the energy by which that person might be showing off. So if a hunter starts showing off he's the best hunter, the guys refuse to go hunting with him, the women refuse to cook his food, and that will be how they do it. If a guy starts showing off in any way, everyone's almost demanded upon them as an individual to speak to power whenever it emerges. And one of the main tools is the women coming together en masse in this ritual that they call, this ritual is called Ingoku. And this is when they basically hold the men to account for that agreement that they made all that time ago for holding peace and not being aggressive and competitive in the community. So if anyone's been a lazy lover, or if anyone's being aggressive in the home or anything, the women come together and they use their own quality of power in order to hold the men to account. And what was really the most extraordinary thing living with this group, and also the Penan, was this was the first time I had the opportunity to really experience true egalitarianism, because everywhere else I've been and all of my travels, they had hierarchy, they had chiefs, they had shaman, and here is where they didn't have that. And what was the net result of that was to see what a truly egalitarian society was like for women. And here was a group of women who didn't have to be acting from their masculine or acting like the men in order to be powerful. They had their own quality of power in order to be however it is that they wanted to be. And it tended to be laughter, song, sexuality, teasing, and the threat of sex strike, and all of this bundled together, but their own thing. And so I think that's what you were referring to, Rosalind. It's one of the most powerful things I've ever seen in my life, and definitely part of the sort of narrative of today that people don't know enough about, and it needs to come back. But it was too hot to handle for the film. To why? It was because of, you know, sex and gender and all of this stuff, and a male voice talking about it, and that. Yeah. I ended up taking it out because it was too hot a potato for me. I didn't have the courage, I didn't have the knowledge to be able to hold it fully. So it ended up coming out of the film, sadly. But I'm now on a journey to get that back into the world.
It's beautiful. It reminds me, because it's, I guess it's the power of satire as well, the power of the fool. And then I suppose it made me think your answer there. Thank you for this, by the way. This is great. The sort of how masculinity and femininity express itself in the Penan that you say are sort of very, very much egalitarian, whether I assume that sort of men and women have different roles, but perhaps that these concepts of masculinity didn't manifest in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, like they wouldn't be referring to themselves in the same way. They would, you know, for the Benjeli, you know, the expression that all of those women, biological women coming together, can be whatever it wants. And I guess you would say that that would be their gender expression, because it's all of them together in whichever way. When they separate out into their spaces, they can be all very different. But when they're together as a group, this is how their group expresses itself. And likewise with the Penan, it's very sad that you don't hear much from the women. You know, people do think, well, how can it be egalitarian if people have different roles? But that's because we get confused between equality and sameness. And for them, it's like, no, everyone's different, and the men and the women are different. We're just all equal in our status and our power, essentially. And so that's what's important to them. But the difference is celebrated, and the difference is acknowledged and seen. And so with the Panan, for example, the women were less prone to want to talk to me about various things, and the men I kind of connected with more. And that's quite common in many Indigenous groups. But it didn't mean, just like you heard the women tell the guys to shut up, that the women weren't present. They just weren't necessarily so present in my film, which I'm kind of ashamed of. Actually, I wish it had come out differently. But it's all going to come out in the long run with when the Benjeli kick ass on the planet.
I think with an eye to the time, I think it would be wonderful to open up to the floor, but I've just got one kind of broader question for you with which to begin doing that, which is about creating an egalitarian community and kind of coming back inspired by all of the knowledge that you amassed as you went around the world meeting these tribes. And I was just wondering if there were kind of some general principles that stuck with you, and then some more specific principles where you knew kind of, I'd like to live like this from now on based on that tribe, and kind of which were the really sticky concepts that you brought back that have kind of become ways of life that you've integrated now.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I was so taken by the whole of, blown away when I met the Panan, and then also when I met the Benjeli. It was like, well, no one knows this. This needs to be shared. And I realized that I could see people kind of glazing over when I was talking to them about it. It felt so far away from anything that seemed real or reasonable. I was like, okay, maybe I need to live this. So have been trying to put together a community that might be a lived example so that others can experience that. That hasn't happened yet. But to answer your question, I did write out a manifesto. Maybe it was a bit too much actually for the group that I was talking to at the time. But the general principles would be around power. Power at the heart of it. It's decentralizing power, not allowing power to ever get fixed or static or landing in one person in particular. It's all about decentralization. But decentralization isn't enough. You look at how Bitcoin is talking about big decentralization, but it still allows for accumulation. So it's decentralization in all aspects of power, including accumulation, including showing off, including everything. So it's basically all about power, whichever tools we have for holding that, which would be the narrative that's how it was, and that we all have to hold to it. This isn't going through a central body that organizes. This is not a Politburo. Every individual autonomously required to speak to power at every moment, and to stop showing off, to stop status growing, all that sort of stuff would be part of it, and everyone working at that the whole time in the belief that that's how we're happiest and better off. And there's a whole bunch of studies that can show that, but I guess that would be the best one. The simplest one is just looking at power. It's a journey that I'm still very much on, but I think ownership's an interesting one. We're so tied up in these areas. I try not to call it my place. I definitely wouldn't call any offspring of mine my own. All of these sorts of things. It's like, that's kind of weird that we call it my child. It's like just trying to reevaluate all of these ideas is an interesting journey to go on. And in Welsh, we're talking about language, they don't call things mine. It's like something that travels with me. They also have a word like Tawai for home. It's called Hiraeth, which is a little bit similar. And and I was even like deciphering belonging the other day as a really interesting word. It's like to long. It's a longing. It's a feeling of longing, and being an extenuating word. So, it's just bringing these things back, I think, is reconnecting with our past.
Do you want to just give us a quick translation of Tawai for the people who haven't seen the film?
Yeah, it's mentioned about 3 times in the film, and basically there is no direct translation, as you eloquently started this whole chat with. But there are 3 occasions that it's very clearly used. One is when my friend Jeffrey says, when I go into the forest in the fruiting season, I feel Tawai for the forest, because it's like being held, like a mother holds her baby to the breast. you feel nurtured, you feel held, you feel comfort, you feel whole, so that would be, I think, the strongest notion of what Tawai is for them. It's a sense of knowing and trusting and believing that you can be nurtured and held by the forest. He also says there's no Tawai in the disturbed forest where the palm plantations are. So it's not a universal thing. It's a specific thing to an untouched place. And then he says, I remember the time that when we used to hunt in this way, I felt Tawai. So it's a nostalgia as well, which is why I find this word belonging interesting. When you feel this word longing has a nostalgic element to it. And this word haraith in Welsh also has a nostalgic element to it. So, it's not so far away when you really pull these things apart. But for most of us, we don't, on our daily chat, we're a long way away from feeling a sort of like nostalgic, heart-wrenching feeling of longing for a place. That's just, we're not there. Apart from that place that does the good croissants on a Sunday morning.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Shall we open up to a couple of questions?